Hey, Richard here, jumping in at the top of this episode just to set it up a little bit and to frame it. Otherwise, it might seem a little bit coming out of left field. So, I recorded this quite some time ago, but I've been waiting for the right time to release it. And now feels like the right time to me because of what we're seeing happening and being discussed as well in the United States in the lead up to their presidential election, particularly around the issue of political violence. And a few years ago there was the Capitol riot, and then this year we've seen a couple of attempts on a presidential nominee's life, and there's been discussion around this political violence, and we might call it political violence, but one of the inescapable facts of this is that people claiming Christ, claiming to follow the Prince of Peace, have in fact been involved with and advocates of, at least tolerant of, this kind of violence, and so it's not a world away from religious extremism, and so this topic, or of this episode, is around religious extremism, and you might be thinking, well, okay, this is a New Zealand podcast, and at More Than Theology, we do really try to focus on, challenges that are facing believers or the church here in Aotearoa. But what happens in the United States, and what happens in the church in the United States often does have quite a significant influence on what happens in the church here. But we don't have to uncritically swallow everything that comes from our counterparts in the United States. And so for me, for us to be informed about this is important, I think, so that we do not go down the path of advocating violence that might seem like a long way off in New Zealand, and may that indeed, in fact, be the case now and forevermore. But we've got to be wise, we've got to be aware, and so this episode is all about developing that awareness. And to help us with that, we are speaking with a leading expert globally on the topic of religious extremism. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope it gives you some food for thought. Hi, welcome to More Than Theology, the Pathways Bible College podcast. And today we're talking about religious extremism with a particular focus on the Christian community. And our guest today is Dr. Douglas Pratt. Dr. Pratt has had a distinguished career as a scholar and a priest. He has taught in religious studies and been a professor at University of Waikato, where I did my undergraduate, and I was certainly aware of him in those days. He's also been a lecturer at the University of Auckland and the University of Bern in Switzerland, has also served at times as an Anglican priest. So, Doug, welcome along. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, and I just am interested in this topic of religious extremism, or in our correspondence beforehand, I was calling it radicalization. Can we just get our terms straight? Because you mentioned that that's actually kind of in the field as a technical term. So what is radicalization and what is extremism?
Well, both really depend on the context. It's interesting that the negative use of radicalization, meaning effectively extremism, has been recently applied more in the Islamic field, where people talk about Muslim radicals. Whereas in the history of Christianity, radicalization has a different kind of pedigree. It can, in certain historic periods, mean that those who are radicals were perceived as terrorists and therefore burnt at the stake or whatever. Right. But theologically, it's had a much more nuanced I think, understanding in terms of people who are wanting to shake the foundations, challenge the received traditions. I mean, the Reformation was basically radical, and when it happened, and continuing reformations and changes and challenges since. So radical can mean a deep rethinking, which can have very positive and creative, but also quite far-reaching changes, radical changes, as we say, but not necessarily extreme in a negative sense of that currently where that term has got to currently.
Gotcha. And tell us, How did you become interested in the topic of religious extremism?
Well, actually, that goes back really to, I think, 2001 and the whole 9/11 event. And the paradox for me was that only a few days before that event, I'd submitted to the University Press of America the final manuscript for a theological work on the doctrine of God, actually, and I sort of thought, oh, now I can, breathe a bit. And I had in mind doing a book on Islam from a Christian perspective, understanding Islam. Then 9/11 happened. I thought, oh, I've got to get into this book. It took me a while to get it published because so many others were in the queue ahead of me. But it came out as the challenge of Islam, subtext, engagement, interfaith dialogue. I think I can't remember. But anyhow, the challenge of Islam. But it was a combination of both an introduction to Islam, written from the point of view of a Christian wanting to understand what Islam is about as much on its terms as possible, but then looking at some theological issues arising from it and some dialogical issues. So it had three parts to it, and that was quite well received. And I know that there were people in different parts of the world who found it a very useful textbook for a while there, and that was good. In fact, Routledge was published by Ashgate originally, bought out by Routledge, who then republished it only just 3 or 4 years ago in their revival library series, I think it was called, as one of the key texts that people should be aware of. So that was rather nice.
Great.
So that got me into Islam, but as part of that was kind of like, what's going on in terms of the extremist stuff. Then of course 2005 happened, the London bombings. That's what really moved me more in the direction of not just Islam, but Islamic extremism, and then more widely what extremism is. And partly that was because at the aftermath of the London bombings, several things happened. One, here in New Zealand, a number of Muslim mosques, and there weren't many, were attacked, or Muslim people were affronted and so on. Right. And there was a sense in which the Muslim community locally were being blamed for what was happening in London. And there was this growing naive assumption that all Muslims are terrorists by nature.
Yeah.
On top of that, the Home Office in Britain released a report endeavouring to try and identify likely terrorists. And the description they gave, I thought, this could apply to just about any youth group, Bible class group, Muslim, Christian, or whatever,
right,
in the way it was framed. And I thought, they're not identifying the right factors. And so I began to ask myself the question, what are the kind of factors? What is the link between a religious belief of whatever sort and the form of extremism that ends up in violence and destruction? Because there isn't any necessary link. Like there are people, because the other word that came into play was fundamentalism. So the kind of naive use of the language of the day was that fundamentalists are extremists, and there are many Muslims who, from their point of view, we are fundamentalists because we believe in our faith, and there are many Christians who do the same thing. I adhere to the fundamentals of the faith, but I'm not an extremist because of that, and so on. So that's when I began to sort of examine the concepts quite closely and try and identify what are the stepping stones from holding a particular religious belief and ending up as a violent extremist. And I ended up coming up with something which got published. I think you might have read it because I see you read that book on interreligious relations. The Oxford
I
book.
read your chapter from that book. Yes.
So I expounded that in there and other places too. I had a very interesting early presentation of that here in New Zealand at Victoria University, Wellington, back I think in 2006 or 7, around there. It wasn't that long after, when I was in the early stages of developing this kind of analysis. And I was invited to speak at a security conference held at Wellington. And it was in 2 parts. There was the security conference because it had in people from the military and intelligence agencies and all that kind of stuff from around the Pacific, Australia, Pacific, New Zealand, and so on. And they met sort of, you might say, that was a secure conference. Only those people registered and were legitimately able to go there could be at that part of it. But they had a parallel conference, breakout conference, which was academics bringing in papers that were germane to the whole field. And so I sat in on some of those before I had mine. I noticed, maybe a dozen or 20 people might have come from the main conference and heard someone on the psychology or whatever. Then there was a lunch break, and then I was on, and blow me down, I walked back in, and the theatre was absolutely packed. Most of the conference had come over because my topic was on the relation between religion and extremism.
Wow.
And I was looking at that question: what is the relationship between them? And that's why I gave that initial exposition, which fundamentally, I suppose, breaks it into my position. There'll be three parts. There's a belief system, and that belief system can harden and become much more demanding, mainly on its own adherents. You mentioned, there's various sects within Christianity that are very tight on their own. I think of Gloriavale, for example, we already know. If you were in Gloriavale, it's very impositional on them, but not to the rest of society. But then the third phase is where a religious belief system becomes highly impositional onto wider society. And so there's been phases in terms of Christian history where that's been the case, which is when the radicals have come in to break free from that imposition. Right. A lot of the Reformation and later post-Reformation stuff. I think of the Anabaptists and others who the Radical Reformation, for example, and within. So within some Islamic groups, you can see that same kind of thing. So one of my questions was, okay, if I can track a ideological development that can take place from having a particular set of religious beliefs to end up being highly impositional and violent with it upon a society, can it run the other way? Can you pull it back? And the indications I found subsequently is that yes, it does happen. And it happens, and you see there's been examples a few years ago. There was quite a notable British Muslim scholar, younger man, who wrote a book. I can't remember the title of it now. It's got somewhere. But he'd been there in the extremists, and he'd pull back, and sort of seen there and in his own terms pull back. I've come across in a conference I was in Australia a few years ago, two highly trained Muslim imams who are psychologists working in the British justice system, working to de-radicalize extremists who'd been jailed, right, and so on, and basically, it was quite powerful, because what this guy was saying is that he was doing it for two reasons. One, because they are misrepresenting what Islam is about, and the second, because of justice for the society as a whole, those kind of things. So I thought, that's interesting. Now, that would require another field of study, more psychologists, I think, to look at the kind of ideological structure that I came up with and see how that works in terms of individuals. Because one of the things that's also quite important to note is that there is, there are belief systems and ideologies that flow from that, which can undergird certain behaviors, but it is individuals who carry out the behaviors. And when they carry out the behaviors, they're not just driven by ideologies. There can be other drivers, psychological, sociological, whatever as well. So it becomes more complex when you examine an individual actor. But insofar as when in certain circumstances, and it's been more particularly evident in Islamic extremism, but not only, where the justification for actions has been very much framed in religious terms, then it's important to be able to tackle the religious ideology, and try and combat it from, it's the war of ideas.
Yeah. So, you've already mentioned the way you got into this topic was through your interest in Islam and looking at it from a Christian perspective. And certainly in the popular imagination since 9/11 in particular, we've equated extremism, religious extremism, with Islam. Um, what about within the Christian church? Where do we see extremism, and what are the trends? Is it on the increase or decrease, or sort of both, or what do you think?
Well, basically, as with Islam, it's in very particular patches and places. At the moment, you'd have to say the sort of religious extremism in Christianity that is almost a parallel with Islam is happening in the southern United States.
Mm.
It's the language they use in the United States in certain areas. I think of in the way that, for example, you're now having situations where some of the southern states, it's the tie-up of certain forms of conservative republicanism and certain forms of highly conservative fundamentalist evangelicalism, Christianity, has brought about an intense ideologically driven political system that directly parallels, for example, what has been happening in Afghanistan. So you have this kind of imposition. It's the impositional element I'm getting at. It's not whether or not you get killed or shot. It's that sense of imposition that takes away the rights of people to actually choose and act, and a sense of the loss of compassion. It's imposition without any kind of compassion. There are other times, of course, in societies where things are imposed on the public at large, but for good reason, for compassionate reasons, or for the sense of law and order, or whatever. But these are examples where you have a religiously, ideologically driven agenda that imposes limitations and high prescriptions upon a populace who are not themselves part of that ideology or that religion. And insofar as, in those general terms, we see it happening in certain quarters in the Islamic world. We're seeing it happening in certain quarters of the so-called Christian, it's more a secular Christian world, which is the America. And it's happening in parts of the Buddhist world when you think of Myanmar, for example.
Oh, yes.
And its imposition on the locals. It's happening in a purely atheistic communist world of China. Mm-hmm. And I suspect also, in some degree, in the Soviet, in Russia, the old Soviet Union. Mm. And it's happening in certain Catholic countries like Poland, for example, and Hungary, which are Catholic but also highly secular. So you can see that impositional, and that really, I think, to me, is the clue to what extremism is about, is that it is to do with an impositional exclusivism. It's excluding all other options. It's excluding a range of possibilities, and says that you must all be the same and must obey the same, whatever it is, but in a highly exclusive and narrow way that takes away from wider freedoms, and also generally undercuts other values such as compassion and care.
So, thinking about it that way, does that mean something like medieval Europe was extremist because, it was like the church ran the show and there weren't a whole lot of other religious options that were realistic? So is that the same thing, or is that something different?
It's on the same line. It's not quite the same thing because that's a unitary system, but it yielded elements of imposition. Like, for example, if you objected and stood out from the crowd, and one say, well, you weren't allowed to.
Sure.
And that's where the impositional comes in. And this is interesting. And this is the interesting thing in terms of certain societies. Well, in fact, you'd probably say it runs through all of these examples I've alluded to. From the point of view of those in charge, what they want is a sense of uniformity, compliance, and unity for the sake of the cohesion of society. It's only in modern times that modern democracies, basically coming out of Britain initially, had the social compact of, yes, you can be different so long as you adhere to law and order and don't impose on other people.
Right.
So that, for example, it's only up until I think it was the late 19th or early 20th century when you could be admitted to Oxford and Cambridge without having to be a card-carrying Anglican.
Mm, mm,
But prior to that, and in the lead up to that, as other non-Anglican forms of Christianity emerged, take for example Methodism. Methodism emerged out of the Anglican Church in the 18th century, um, and in order not to be regarded as how can I put it? Prior to that period, if another organization emerged, you were seen to be automatically regarded as somehow a traitor to your country because you were opposing the king and the constitution, the structure of society. But the Methodists got around that because at every conference, annual conference, they began by the oath of allegiance to the crown. In other words, saying, we are not part of the established church. We are a Christian community. We are different to you, but we are not here to actually undermine, and we're not traitors, we're not insurrectionists, we're not that kind of thing. Yes, we will challenge society, yes, we will, and so on and so forth. I mean, you know, I was brought up a Methodist, that was my background. So the social gospel and the evangelical gospel were together in my upbringing. And so, you know, that's just an example of how there was a period of time where we, over the 200 or 300 years, where out of this a period of time, to contemporary, by the time of the 20th century, modern democracy that allowed for the variety of religious identities, primarily initially, of course, is a variety of Christian identities.
sure.
But also a variety of and none, and also a variety of political identities. So the fact that you were to the left or to the right, so long as you're under the king, then it's okay. We can have our differences, but we are still one nation. That was the model. And that's still fundamentally the model of our own society. We can have great diversity of expressions of faith, belief, community association, now gender and all those kind of things. But we're within one society overarched by parliament and that kind of structure. It's only if you get situations where you then have one group saying, no, that's not good enough. We want the whole of society our way.
Right.
And if we can't get it, then we're going to arm ourselves and take it. And that's where you get extremism then emerging as this kind of total impositional stuff.
Yeah. So how does there's a kind of a paradox there when you have these sort of violent forms of extremism, which I'm as far as I'm aware probably isn't that common in New Zealand, but you know we've seen over the last few years the world's changed quite radically in some ways, and there's been lots of polarization in you know the sort of Trump's America, but then into COVID, and you know that polarization has been seen around the world, including in our own country. So you know, depending on how things unfold in the coming years, it's not too hard to imagine that some people might sort of head down that path. But there's a kind of a paradox in that, obviously, Christian faith, following Christ, the Prince of Peace, who taught us to turn the other cheek, and yet at some point it turns violent, or for some people it turns violent. So how does that paradox or that contradiction take place?
I don't know how it takes place. It's kind of like, how do we respond to it, really? Because I think certainly we've seen, as we know, interestingly in our case in New Zealand, triggered more by the pandemic than by, for example, the mosque massacre.
Yes.
The mosque massacre certainly did something in our country. It certainly brought to light some quite deep-seated antipathies and difficulties that quite a few people have with the other. Like, for example, you can be in a society and have people in a society you absolutely can't get on with and even think they shouldn't be part of it, but you tolerate.
Sure.
So tolerance is kind of like the baseline to hold diversity together in a kind of like, well, so long as they don't upset me and they keep to their corner and not bother me, and okay, let them be kind of thing. But then you have situations where it's not enough just to be tolerant. You have to actually learn to accept, and that becomes the harder one. and particularly if there's been a sense of injustice or whatever. And then there's the sense of fear, and the fear often is focused on a fear of me losing something, losing my freedom, losing my rights, losing my ability to choose. Now, curious enough, that came to sharp focus with the pandemic, and the way the government responded. It was responding from the point of view: here's a public health issue. Here's a history where an awful lot of our people, last time this happened, died, and communities were decimated. We can't risk that happening again. We have to impose certain restrictions on the country in order to save ourselves. Now, you can argue the toss about the rights and wrongs and how they went about certain things, but you can't argue the fact that we've ended up with an incredibly low death rate and very little impact, except for the economic one, obviously. But the biggest one was, of course, the mandates, which had their place, but were reacted to very, very badly. Yet, curiously, we had one of the highest rates in the world of vaccination. So an awful lot of people chose to be vaccinated. Some may have, the mandate may have tipped them over. But then you had a minority, a very vocal minority, who utterly objected to the mandates. Either they still got vaccinated, so I choose to be vaccinated, but I object to mandates. Quite a few people did that. Or there were those more diehard who said, no, I refuse to be vaccinated and I refuse to submit to a mandate. So I will, even if I lose my job. Now, curiously, the basic dynamic of that is not unlike radical Protestants years ago who objected to, say, the strictures of the Roman Inquisition and would prefer to face to lose whatever they had, even their lives, than step down. In other words, their conscience and so on. That becomes, I think, is the hardest test. Is where you feel, for good, right or wrong, you feel that your own sense of identity and your own conscience is being imperiled by this dictate from whoever the state is on. And that's a very tricky one. I mean, because it's also the question of context. Here we have it was a kind of the wider society. When we began the pandemic and we kind of had a warm feeling about being part of the team of 5 million, that was a good slogan, a good sense of that we're in this together. But further down the track, when it became now we have to mandate certain things, and if you don't have to take the jab, then you can't do X, Y, and Z. That's then when it turned. And then you have an incredible reaction. Now, that then became a mask, a smokescreen for something actually much more sinister that we hadn't been aware of till now. And that's more of an insurrection type of reaction that came through, where you had people, there were people, for example, who protested the mandates, fair enough. But within that, underneath that, there was another group who actually are, in effect, quite anarchist. They wanted, people to be executed. They wanted, if they could, they would have been the Taliban and just gone out and shot anyone that they didn't like. And they want to overthrow the system, which is back to classic anarchy from the late 19th, 20th century, and insurrection. And then you find, of course, that was actually tied in with what's going on, what was happening in Canada, what was happening in the United States, and you realise there's actually an international linkage going on here, imposing itself on our country. And that became a cause of concern. Happily for us, it seemed to have all died down because, as I mentioned before, it actually, in terms of the pandemic, was an incredible minority because the vast majority of the country were quite, could see the point of it and say, yes, we must protect ourselves and so on and so forth. So, yeah, the propensity, I think, for extremism is there. I suspect it'll just simmer away and from time to time will bubble up a bit. But I actually think there's something about our New Zealand psyche and context whereby, in the end, we're prepared to give people a fair go. What we don't like, of course, is where people are imposed upon, they don't get a fair go. And to that extent, I think people who were happy to take the jab didn't like the idea of mandates, but it didn't affect them personally because they had the jab, but still objected and protested mandates in principle.
Yeah.
And I can understand that, although, of course, the flip side is that we all are subject to the mandates all the time. We must drive on the left-hand side of the road. If we don't,
Right.
there's chaos.
Yeah.
That's a mandate, or wear your seatbelt or whatever.
Mm.
You can sometimes choose not to wear your seatbelt. You take your life in your own hands, but there's a mandate there. There are mandates all around us.
Mm. Mm. You touched a little bit on fear, and I think a lot of evangelical Christians are increasingly feeling marginalized, and that may not always be completely accurate, but that's certainly the perception that as secularization increases, for a lot of evangelical Christians, a feeling of fear, I think, might be kicking in, or at least there's a potential for that. Am I hearing you right in saying that obviously not always, but can be a key factor in leading to a kind of extremism?
Well, it could be, but doesn't have to be.
Right.
I think it's only would it be if somebody, I can't think of offhand a trajectory. I mean, one could potentially find that, but I think it's more likely there's a whole heap of things in that. I mean, yes, I think it's not just evangelical Christian. I think all of us, all Christians, whatever stripe we want to wear in terms of our particular label, are feeling a greater sense of keeping our heads down
Sure.
in the society. And that's not without good reason at the moment. We are in an epoch at the moment where it's almost like the old pattern of the church hounding the witches has been flipped.
Mm-hmm.
And the church is the witch that society is hounding.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's all been a result of the abuse scandals, and not only contemporary ones, but the historic one, as a whole change of society has come about. And you have some, immensely tragic situations of where abuse has been uncovered by people, in the church, whatever line of authority, and so on and so forth. And as a result of that, the church has lost, this is overall, its moral voice in society.
Right.
When I was growing up, for example, when I was in my teens and early 20s, I can remember there was that season at a certain time of the year when the major churches, Anglican, the Methodist, the Presbyterian, as well as others, but those ones had their annual conferences, and the media were there. And every night, as I said, I was a Methodist. I remember every night during conference, the week of conference, at 11 o'clock, there would be a roundup on national radio of what happened that day, and so on and so forth. Same thing when the Presbyterians met, when the Anglicans met, and there would have been reports when other church groups met and what they might have had to say about social issues and so on and so forth. Church leaders would have the ear of politicians and would try and intervene at certain times and so on. They still try, but there's less persuasive these days. But you never get the media automatically coming and taking, And I remember a few years ago when I chaired one of the National Interfaith Forums. It was held in Hamilton, and we were launching at that one a book that was on spirituality in the workplace. And it was also, and I remember contacting the media that this is, it was being released by the Human Rights Commission, I think it was, or something like that. And no, religion, no interest.
Yeah.
Nobody's interested.
Yeah.
Wow, what a,
Yeah.
that was a few years ago now. So I think, we're at a phase where it's not easy being a Christian in the public square. And we have to be a bit cautious about it, be a bit careful. And I think it comes back now to me, the adage of evangelicalism now really resides in that phrase, don't tell me, show me. Because it's the way we live our lives and what we do rather than what we say. Because as soon as you open your mouth and try and say something,
yeah.
What about, and so on,
Yeah.
and all the negative stuff comes out.
Yeah.
But be Christ-like in our actions and our lives and so on and so forth. And hopefully, that will just simmer away, and in God's good time, new fruit will emerge.
Mm. Maybe it might be good to just think a little bit about some of our listeners and imagining, if a listener or viewer of this podcast had someone in their life, their family or their church who they felt was becoming, more extremist or heading down an extremist path. Is there any kind of advice or anything you'd want to say to them?
That's tricky because it a little bit depends on context. One of the problems today, of course, is, and which certainly I know the authorities have found in both here and overseas, is the avenue for extremism and radicalization in that extreme sense is the online platforms.
Right.
And often we don't know what people are looking at and absorbing and online. And there's been numerous instances of Muslim parents expressing concern about what they're seeing, what they're hearing of their young people saying, and so forth, to the point where a number of the preemptive arrests that have been made, particularly in Australia, I'm not sure about here, but I know in Australia and in the United States, has been because Muslim parents or Muslim community have dobbed these people in saying, we are concerned about, and they've taken an extra far. There's also been cases where that concern has been raised and ignored.
Yes, yeah.
And in one case, that resulted in the Underpant bomber back in January 2006, who tried to blow up a plane in the United States with chemicals concealed in his pants. All he did was burn his groin. But that was a case where the parents, the father, had been in touch, said, my son is doing so and so, and I'm sorry, I just need to. I'm concerned about him, what he might do. But the checking out was minimal, and they thought, no, he's all right, but he wasn't. So that's, shall we say, that is a very extreme reaction to a very extremist type of situation. But in other cases where there's concern, the biggest concern I think I would have in this country is evidence of people who are becoming much more narrow in their thinking, not just socially, but also religiously, having very hardline, narrow framework. I mean, from my perspective as a theologian, as well as a scholar of religions, speaking as a Christian, I see the Christian story, the Christian narrative, the Christian text, the scriptures, and the history as being incredibly open and broad and embracive, and with great depth. And where the problems come in is where people narrow it down and it becomes a very, very narrow. And I remember there was a title of a book that came out some years ago, Your God is Too Small. Yes. It's almost like people shrink God and say, this is my God, and it's here, and anything outside is verboten, is beyond the pale or of the devil or whatever. That kind of thinking closes people off from other people, and I think in the end closes people off from God and from God's grace, because you are narrowing down, you are dictating to God what is and is not, instead of being open to what is from God's point of view. And I think that kind of, where there's a signal of that, then I guess hopefully turning to some people who are skilled at counseling and who have a depth of Christian faith, who can help and talk. And it's not easy. There's no easy solution. But I think just as with programs that have been happening overseas in terms of using this term again, de-radicalization of young Muslims who have gone off the rails and end up extremists, from the point of view of saying they didn't really understand their faith. They've had a misinterpretation, a warped interpretation of it. If they knew the full breadth of the Muslim faith, they realize that this is not the way at all. And so they are trying to address them and educate them on their own faith terms. And so there are times, I think, when we in Christianity need to do something similar. And sometimes, and I mean, you come across this a lot, I mean, in society at large, how can I put it? I spent 30 years of my life as an educator in the religious studies field, and I don't know that it made a drop of difference to the total value of people's understanding of religion, because not many people took religious studies. But in the world around, I so often come across people whose comments about our faith or about any other faith are so limited, so informed by just prejudice and stereotype. And I think, oh my gosh, we have to start from the beginning all over again. People
Mm.
just don't have an understanding of what religion, and let alone what our religion, is about at all.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
I think I realised I was losing losing the plot when one of my introduction to religion classes, when I came on the Christian section, and please sir, who's Moses?
Oh, right.
Please sir, what's the gospel? I thought, oh, where do I
Yeah.
start? Where do I start?
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
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 The just and I think, unfortunately, religious ignorance of religion
Yeah.
is one of the key drivers to an apathy about religion, which can then be opening to a gullibility for other ideologies, including extreme religious ideologies, because I think that's what religion is. And a closing comment from me, people like Richard Dawkins, for example, are high-flying scientists, but utterly naive and incredibly narrow when it comes to religion.
Right.
And so he bases all his judgments on religion on a very narrow understanding.
Mm.
But if he tried to do science that way, he'd be shot down in flames.
Mm. Mm. Interesting.
So another kind of extremism.
Yeah. And he's been often described as a fundamentalist atheist or atheist fundamentalist.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Oh, well, fantastic. You recently moved down to the South Island from Auckland. What's this next chapter of life hold for you? What projects are you working on? That sort of thing.
Well, I'm trying to slide into retirement. I finished teaching, but I'm still doing research and writing. I'm involved in an international project now. I've been since 2012, so over coming up 12, 13 years. On a bibliographical history of Christian-Muslim relations. This is a major international research project which I'm still working on. I'm one of the editorial group, and I've had responsibility as a research team leader for the whole of Asia section, which includes Australasia and so on. We're up to volume 21. All the volumes are about that thick, and they're trying to basically identify, since the inception of Islam, historically speaking, all known works written by a Muslim or by a Christian about, for, or against the other. So it's descriptive, polemical, apologetic, whatever. Then we're going down to the project ends in 1914, roughly speaking. In other words, the end of what's called the long 19th century, because the 20th century is a whole different ballgame again. Sure. The first 900 years dealt just with manuscripts, and I wasn't part of that project. I helped in the design of it, but I wasn't part of that because that required language specialists with manuscripts. And then from roughly 1500 down to the 20th century, it's been more geographically. So we've divided the world into 5 zones, and each zone has a team. Each zone has a team leader. And so I've had that role, as well as I'm the one of the key editors for the whole 19th century. The 19th century is about a third of the entire volume so far of material, because it was, just blossoming out into a whole range of genres of material and so on. So it's doing that, and we also write. We've done one already, and the second one is underway. A book of essays that explore what this history is about. Right. And so I've done work on that field as well. So that's a major work I've been part of, and I've still got a couple of other projects that I'd like to get to, but I have to get this major research project finished. I mean, we're all getting older now. Those of us, we all started when mid-career, and those of us who are finishing it off, we're all retired, and the money's run out, and so we're just doing it for life.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Pratt. Thank you for joining us on the podcast today and giving us some insights from your considerable expertise in this area. I really appreciate it. So thanks for being on.
Thank you. Good to help out. Bye now. Bye.
Ka kite anō.
Kia ora.